There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world...
First question I want to ask you is, do you remember when you first came in touch with Paul Robeson? Year, place?
No, I don't. I first saw Paul in New York at a peace rally. I first met him when he came out to Local 600 to address the general council there, and in support of whatever endeavor, probably a strike at that time. I got to know him very well during the course of the National Negro Labor Council, which was established in 1951 in Cincinnati. We had a national convention, and Paul was a part of that convention, a major part of that convention. He spoke, he sang, and he engaged in the deliberations. And he did the same thing in subsequent conventions. In 52 in Cleveland, in 53 in Chicago, and in Detroit from time to time as we had our executive meetings. Before that, I'm wrong, I met him right after Peekskill. And that had to be about 48, 49.
That was in August
49, yeah.
He came to Detroit right after Peekskill.
We were his first stop. You know, Detroit is known for the strength and unity of its people, and particularly its black people. And at that time, he was under attack. He'd been blacklisted and barred from appearing on the stage anywhere. So he could not practice his art. He couldn't appear on the stage in America, and the State Department denied him a passport to go abroad, where he was in great demand. When they finally granted Paul the right to travel, only when he was ill in his last days, he must have had 5 or 6 years of reservations, demand, backed up over the period of time, all over the world, not only in the socialist world, as most people accuse him of catering to, but also in France and in Italy and England. He was much revered and beloved in England, for instance, for his rendition of Shakespeare, Othello, not to mention his concert presentations. Paul was a great actor. He was one of the most versatile men I ever knew. As you know, he was an All-American football player, tight end, but he was big enough to play tight end and tough enough to play linebacker on defense. They went 2 ways in those days. But he invented the end-around play, which meant he was fast enough to get from one end to another and then knock some people over. He made, and this is a shame on America, he made Walter Camp's All-America. I'm sure Team U must have that mentioned somewhere. And I don't know when the hell that was, 1919?
Yeah, so, right around 1899.
I know it was right around the year of my birth. And when he was blacklisted, they actually expunged his name. And to this day, you can get copies of Camp's All-American with 10 players on it. And that's real vindictiveness, in my opinion. But that just shows you the ill will that visited Paul Robeson. The ill will that he suffered was much like the ill will, I think, that another great black athlete had suffered, Jack Johnson, who was hated because he was heavyweight champion of the world and who would not play an Uncle Tom role, who spoke out proudly. So Paul was all of that. He was a brilliant athlete. He also played a little baseball. He was a catcher who could hit the long ball. So had he chosen to, he could have been, he could not have been in baseball because he could not have been admitted to baseball. It was 1947 before Jackie Robinson became the first black in baseball. But nonetheless, he was a great athlete. He did play pro football with the likes of Bronco Nagurski and others. And he talked about that often in some of the bull sessions in which we would engage as he visited us very often here in Detroit. So,
where did you hang out when you came to Detroit? What did you do?
Gotham Hotel. Gotham was a fine hotel located on John R., right across from Harper Hospital. The owner was very proud of black artists, so he had several suites, like the Robeson suite and the Duke Ellington suite. And the Duke Ellington suite had a white piano and a big oil painting of Duke, and Paul's suite had a piano, of course, a painting of Paul. And there were about 5 or 6 major suites, all beautiful suites, well fitted after black entertainers, artists. He came here right after Peekskill when his life was literally in danger. And I was in charge of security for that visit and for subsequent visits. And I was very logical because I had just a year before been executive secretary of, executive vice president of the CIO Council, Labor Council here in Wayne County CIO Council. And we drew upon the labor movement primarily for Paul's security, both black and white workers. And we had educational committees from all the labor unions. In those days, every labor union had an educational committee. They consisted of guys who ranged from 200 pounds up, who could be very persuasive and educational when the occasion demanded. So I got all these guys together to educate people that Paul wasn't to be messed with. And it was a very exciting period. The first concert was held at Forest Club, or Sonny Wilson's place on Forest and Hastings. It was a large barn of a building, used sometime for a skating rink and roller skating rink, and sometimes they used it for dances. It had a tremendous capacity. We had a tight security around that place, as we had to have. We had a funny type security. We had most of the black guys in the inner circle protecting the location, and the white guys, who were equally as numerous, were in the outer ring, and they stretched over to Woodward Avenue and some of the bars and whatnot in which whites hang out. Detroit was still, well, it's that way today, but not to the same degree. The absolute separation of the races. So you go 5-6 blocks from Hastings Street to Woodward Avenue, and there were bars that catered only to whites. And so they were there with a packet of nickels. In those days, telephone cost a nickel to inform of Central Intelligence, and we had that too, a communication setup. If there were any evidences of trouble or conspiracies, plots, etc., going on. So we had a pretty involved and pretty effective protection for Paul, and black people poured out in great numbers. They overflowed. It was in the summertime, and the ventilation wasn't too good, and I think it was an old warehouse, and so there was no cross ventilation, and there was perspiration on the floor to the extent that it was slippery. People were just packed in that way.
To hear him sing.
Yes.
And speak.
That's right. And we had a second overflow meeting at Shiloh Baptist Church, which is located in the Brewster Project. I think it's on Benson or something like that, and Bobian. Still there in Brewster. So that was a very eventful time.
People were lined up down the streets, we understand, for that event.
Oh, yeah. And subsequently, Paul must have sung here 7, 8 times over a 3-4 year period of the blacklist, always at a black church, and more often than not at Reverend Hill's Hartford Avenue Baptist Church on the east side. Reverend
on the west side, right?
On the west side, you're right. I'm from the east. That slipped. He sang once on the east side. Of course, Forest Club is on the east side.
Just.
So,
and did you attend any of those concerts at the churches?
I was at all of them because I was in charge of security.
Let me ask you the question about security. Dave Moore made sure to have me ask you this question.
Yeah.
He remembers a time when you had to return Robeson to the airport.
Yeah.
And you and him and Chris Alston and Robeson were in the car, and the FBI was tailing you.
Yeah.
And you had to do something to some event that happened at the airport or on the way there. He said you might remember this specific incident, trying to get away from the FBI on the way to the airport.
Well, they were always around, and funny thing, it was a government action that restricted Paul's liberty, and it was a double goddamn insult to have the FBI spying on this man and tailing him rather than protecting him. You see, where were they in Peekskill? And so we always evaded them. We used several methods of doing that. I remember one was they generally followed us a tail. They had a 4-car tail, one up front, one in back, and one on parallel streets. And so if you turned one way, they'd pick you up, and they were radio communication. But we saw diagonal streets. Ain't no parallel to Grand River or Gratiot or a few streets like that. And all you got to do is get yourself a diagonal street and then arrange to have somebody stall in front of the FBI on a couple of streets, and then you can get away. And we did that. It was, I think it was shameful to have to dodge the law enforcement agencies of your own nation, your own country, whose purpose was not to protect, but to spy, and if possible, to compromise and to frame.
At the time of the hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee, there were hearings here in Detroit that I understand you were involved in yourself.
Yeah, that was in '52, in February.
Give us some impressions about your testimony at these?
Well, what had happened, this is during the height of the McCarthy period. The House Un-American Activities Committee was infamous. They had gone into community after community. There was an hysteria abroad in the land. All you had to do was have some witness or some stool pigeon point the finger at someone and accuse them of being a communist or a fellow traveler, and it was enough to cost that person his jobs. So wherever they went across the country, they caused panic and wholesale firings based on unsubstantiated charges from, in many cases, paid informers. And that's nothing new. As you know, the FBI is still using them. The federal government is still using paid informers. I was called as executive secretary of the National Negro Labor Council. And our purpose was very clear, to basically to promote the advancement by the election process of blacks within the labor movement. At that time, there were no blacks on any major international union's executive board. And to break down discrimination against blacks in the workplace. As I indicated, we were dealing mainly with retail, people who would be affected by a picket line or by a boycott. We considered that a pro-American activity in the interest of freedom. And I took the trouble to look at the record of all the persons on that committee, and none of them had anything to be proud of. I've forgotten the chairman, who was from Georgia. But I checked him out, and his district consisted of about 80% blacks, and yet only 5% of the blacks in his district voted in an election. in which he was elected. And so I decided that the best way you had either you run from these guys and you cringe, or you attack. And I thought the best way to handle it would be to attack and to challenge their Americanism. And that's what we did. They were not quite prepared for that. They'd been used to people running and cringing and just rolling over while they kicked them. And we didn't do that in Detroit. I was the first witness to resist and talk back. And then a whole long line of witnesses followed me, including Dave. And all the guys in the labor movement did that. Hal Shapiro's here now on our police commission. And that was the beginning of the end of the House Un-American Activity Committee, February 1952, in the city of Detroit. Because after they left here, people in other cities read about it, and everybody started taking off on them. And pretty soon they ran them out of business. They just folded shop. But that was very exciting.
That was a very courageous act.
Well, I don't think it was courageous. I think we had, I had sense enough to use the Fifth Amendment when I had to, but I also used the First. And the First, as you know, is a guarantee of freedom of speech. And I felt that I had the right to say what I wanted to say, and I did.
Can I back up a little bit about the National Negro Labor Council that you were involved in? I understand that their first convention was in 1950. It was a founding convention. It was called the National Labor Conference for Negro Rights. You were at that event?
Yeah, that was in Chicago.
And there was a continuations committee that was established, which you were one of the three leaders of that committee, along with William Hood and Cleveland Robinson.
Yeah.
And the three of you were assigned the task of building chapters among black workers throughout the country. Is that one of the tasks that you had?
Yeah, the actual founding of the continuation committee was set up in Chicago in 50. The founding convention was 51 in Cincinnati, where Hood was elected president and I was elected executive secretary, and the national headquarters was established in Detroit.
Oh, the national headquarters was here?
Yeah, because I was the national executive secretary, and the reason for that, of course, and the reason for Detroit's unique role in Paul Robeson's life is that we were the strong point of trade unionism, of industrial unionism in the nation, and particularly of organized black union leadership. Long before, we had Negro caucuses. Negro was in, black was out in those days. So we initiated Negro caucuses here as long ago as 1939, 1940. And we were fighting for the advancement of blacks and protection of the interests of blacks in the labor movement.
That's when the CIO, that's when Ford was organized.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Brought in
that's
the Cadillac Square rally.
That's absolutely
correct.
Were you
at that rally?
Yeah, sure. I was on the picket line out there at Ford's, and I remember Paul's coming in very, very well. And I remember the election, I think it was in April of 1941. It might have been May, it was in the spring. When we won the election for the union, and because I wasn't long. I went to work in the post office. I had already been fired from Ford, and I got fired from the post office after 6 months for union activity. And then came Pearl Harbor, and so I took about a 4-year vacation.
After that. Those events in the early 40s and then later on Peekskill in 49, then the climate changed for Robeson as you described, and he was persona non grata in his own country, and I had trouble traveling around.
Another thing about Paul that people don't realize, since he was such a great athlete and therefore had the respect of athletes, black and white, he'd been a professional football player. He was the spokesman, the first spokesman, prominent spokesman for blacks' admission into baseball.
Helping too.
Well, Paul, having a background as a great athlete and who might have well been able to play professional baseball, had he chosen to and had the opportunity existed, and neither of these facts held, was the first prominent black to speak out and demand the admission of blacks to professional baseball. Now, it could have been before World War II. If it was not, it was immediately there afterwards. It could have been, and I think it was a part of the fast-moving events that finally convinced Branch Rickey to pick up Jackie Robinson from the Kansas City Monarchs and put him in a farm club up in Montreal. And the next year, 47, moved him into Brooklyn Dodgers. And so Paul was a part of that. So he has been an intricate part of every struggle in which black people have engaged all his life. And that's why he was so beloved. And that's why I think the State Department and the powers that be in the federal government felt it necessary to silence him. And when he spoke out in Paris, and that was what did it, as you know, for peace, they tried to portray him as a traitor. But it's very obvious that no black people believed it. And a whole lot of white workers didn't believe it either, because he was welcome all over this country by workers who remembered his part in organizing, helping to organize the union and supporting the demands of the union.
That's right, that speech in Paris was in 1949.
That's the one that did it. That was just before Peekskill.
And that was for the World Peace Council.
Now, of course it was peace.
Which is part of our organization, the U.S. Peace Council.
I recognize that.
Yeah, right. That's why we're interested in what you
I thought you might be.
Yeah. Did you ever get to play any sports with Paul Robeson when he came to town here, informally?
No, by that time, Paul was into singing, he wasn't into sports, and I was never a great athlete, so there was no reason.
Did you ever see Robeson in a theatrical performance like Othello?
No.
And you were officially a bodyguard when he came to town here, one of the bodyguards.
Well,
he was a big
if
guy.
you please, I was in charge of security.
Yeah, right. You and like Dave Moore and Chris Alston, those two guys are real big, like Paul Robeson.
Well, you'd have to be big, in security, people play different roles. And we weren't about manhandling people. We were able to lay our hands on those who could. And they were around, I can assure you.
Yeah. Well, let's finish this with just any, if you could give us personal feelings about what you think were Robeson's best qualities, personal qualities. You've said a lot of them already, but which ones stand out in your mind?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, intelligence, perception, courage, soul, whatever that be, the finest sense of soul. And dedication. But I think that courage, a whole lot of people have perception, but there are very few people who have the courage to go where their perception and instinct would lead them, especially as the barriers are raised and the going becomes more and more difficult.
Well, let's close with that. That's wonderful remarks, and we appreciate you recollecting those times in history. It was wonderful, and we're going to have to edit this down somehow or another to save a few words out of it, and there's too many. It's going to be tough to edit, but...
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people around here, as you have discovered. I don't know who else you've talked to.
Well, we've talked to the 9 people who we call witnesses in the show. There's... the ones we haven't reached were Geraldine Bledsoe. Mm-hmm. After the show, we talked to her. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to speak to Mrs. Ross, Dr. Ross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was in her husband's church, Shiloh, that this second overflow concert was held.
All right, we're going to meet with her, hopefully. And there were a whole lot of other people that we just, didn't have the time to fit in. The show is already half an hour too long.
Well, I think he had a particular meaning here in Detroit. I don't think in any other city in the United States, with the possible exception of New York. And in New York, he was more of a cultural figure, a part of the theater rather than a part of people's struggle, which is what he was here. And that gave him a special meaning for us.
Yeah, because of the labor movement in
Detroit. That's right.
Yeah, and we've involved Local 600 in this production, too.
Yeah, well, Paul was very active in support of Local 600. and they in turn in support of him.
You were with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers.
Well, I was
with several of them.
Yeah, UAW first,
Okay. Yeah.
and then public workers at the post office, and then later on with Amalgamated Clothing Workers, with Teamsters. Those four.
I didn't want to bring this up to date, but I have to ask you the question. Now you're on the other side of the fence, in a sense. You have to deal with the unions from the mayor point of view of government. How do you find that?
I deal with unions representing the same workers that I helped organize.
Is that a paradox to you? Is that difficult to handle?
Well, it's not really difficult. The view is different from the other side of the table, but it's the same view. And I think that more than most persons in my position, I understand the problems of the workers and their demands.
And because of that,
and it's better to have in an executive position someone who comes from the ranks of labor than to have someone who comes from some other area, which is essentially anti-labor. To dismantle the discrimination that had kept black people from their rightful place in the organized labor movement. That was one half of our goal. The other half was in the workplace. We fought to break down discrimination, for instance, at American Airlines. We had a picket line there in 1952, 1,500 people. At Sears Roebuck, we were the first to picket for job equality and had some significant national breakthroughs. And that was as much a part, in fact, in the end, it turned out to be the greater part of our effort, because the fight for advancement within the labor union is largely an internal fight and understood by and of interest only to those who are directly involved. But the fight for a job, for instance, in this city, at Sam's Cut Rate, or at Hughes and Hatcher, or at Hudson's, J.L. Hudson's, or at Sears Roebuck, was of considerable interest. Paul Robeson gave all of himself to struggle for equality, freedom, and peace. His artistry and his genius, together with his indomitable courage, established him as one of our greatest Americans. Those who still recall that soul-stirring voice, who still remember the dramatic impact of his stage presence, and who still recollect the vigor and steadfastness with which he maintained his principle, will want to join in keeping alive the spirit and memory of Paul Robeson. For those who know only his name, it is more than important, more important than ever, that they become acquainted with and understand the magnificent legacy he has left. To learn more about this great American, join us on April 9th to celebrate his 90th birthday and find out why Detroiters will always fondly remember this gentle giant.
One paragraph I'd like to ask you to read.
Yeah, the one I hashed up.
I think it was this one.
Yeah.
It was bad for take one. I remember that one.
Yeah.
In the studio, we should do about 12 or 15 times.